I'm Maria Lehman, and I'm one of the two co-hosts of the Qualitative Research Facebook group. We were just commenting this morning. Carlene Brown, Dr. Carlene Brown, and I started this, I think 3 years ago, and it's gone from just the two of us kicking around in it up to over 45,000 people. Usually, people don't necessarily join for the live part of the webinar, and I think that's because you should look at the global map in there sometime of where people are from all around the world. And so that means we will take this recording, we'll post it in the Facebook, but we'll also put it in the YouTube so you can watch it more at your leisure and rewatch it. And then you can also look at Dr. Coker's link there if you want to ask him some kind of question about something that's more sophisticated. So I'm a professor from the University of Northern Colorado in Colorado, USA. I've been a qualitative research professor for, I think, a little over 24 years. I just really lucked out by finding this opening right when I was starting to look around for a position, and it was even set up that I was able to develop the entire area except for the Introduction to Qualitative Research course. And at that time, it was a very difficult field for jobs, just like it is right now. So I don't know what happened for me, but I hit it correctly, so I stayed. And then I really wanted to reach out to more of a global audience because so many times my textbooks are so expensive. So we started working on how could we get knowledge out this way so that it's more accessible for groups that, if a textbook's expensive to someone in the United States, it certainly is globally. And so through here, I bumped into Jonathan Coker's work. At that time, he was a student, and we'll try and put his dissertation in here. It was just so amazing because he had a theatrical aspect to it. And so we had spoken together, and he did a webinar here and then has a text box in one of my books. And now he's been a professor for quite a few years, and I'm going to move into more of a formal introduction for him. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Jonathan Coker. He's an assistant professor of education in the Spadoni College of Education and Social Sciences at the Coastal Carolina University. And when we met, he was working as a high-level IRB administrator while he was looking for his professor job. So he has a big background in formal research ethics also. His publications such as Dueling Reflexivities, Ideography, Exploration of Privilege, inherent in sharing reflexive considerations, demonstrates a deep engagement with the ethical complexities of qualitative data collection. And as we're having the talk today, we will be dropping different links for fully available publications, and we'll also post those with the Facebook posting and the YouTube. Dr. Coker's work often explores sensitive human experiences such as teacher health, identity disclosure, workplace dehumanization, which requires a sophisticated understanding of ethical oversight and human subjects protection. His work is deeply rooted in the study of pedagogy and the professional development of educators. His research focuses on the intersection of teacher education and qualitative methodology, with a particular emphasis on phenomenology. Through this lens, he explores the lived experiences of teachers seeking to understand the essential structures of educational practice and the complex ways in which educators grow throughout their careers. In addition to his research, Dr. Coker is a dedicated teacher scholar who instructs courses in the Masters of Arts in Teaching and the PhD in Education programs. His commitment to the field extends into the broader academic community, where he is active and recognizable voice in groups such as this Qualitative Facebook group. And then I also met him in another group I'm in, Qualitative Research Connect, where he contributes to global conversations in methodological rigor and innovation. Along with Dr. Jonathan Coker today, we have Francesca Panarosa, and I'm going to have Dr. Coker introduce her, but please join me in welcoming Dr. Coker.
Hey, everybody. So nice to be here. So I am joined by the amazing Francesca Panarosa. Some of this we're going to get into when we sort of talk about like the genesis for this project, but Francesca is a graduate student at the University of Ottawa, specifically in the philosophy department, with a special emphasis in phenomenology. Francesca and I have co-authored a book chapter, and we have two other publications in the works. So I would say that would be my. I'm not quite as talented as Maria Lehman in providing such an excellent introduction. But Francesca, have I left anything out?
No, I don't think so. I mean, we've known each other for a while. Thanks for the impressive introduction. Um, yeah, I'm looking forward to this, and yeah, we've got a lot to talk about.
Yes. So I'm just gonna get right into it if we're ready. Um, so this is our presentation on phenomenological validity, going deeper with Heidegger's existential structures. So, kind of as we mentioned before, sort of a neat fact about Francesca and I is we actually have known each other since high school. So we've known each other a really long time. But we didn't really know that we had a mutual interest in this until I would say maybe like 4 years ago. So it was kind of a recent discovery. So I was teaching a qual methods course at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. And I was able to do it like online because I was still in Florida. And we had a phenomenology unit, and it wasn't very robust. It wasn't very good. And so I had reached out to Francesca because she has a background in philosophy. That was your undergraduate degree at the College of Charleston. And so we kind of started talking. We made a really fabulous unit for the students. The students really responded. It was lovely. And then that collaboration led to this book chapter that you see in the chat called Broodmother, where we analyzed data I had collected for my dissertation through a phenomenological lens. And that just kind of got us really excited and led us to other writing projects. And as we kind of got into this, we started reading a lot of phenomenological work. And we kept finding some sort of similar problems, which was the genesis of this project, is how do you make something of quality in phenomenology? So here's sort of the general problems as we see them. So we're going to kind of take turns. This first part I'm going to talk about, and then I'm going to go back and forth with Francesca here. So I have this sort of like image of like the house that looks like really thin and not quite built out. And that sort of represents to us what we sort of see as some of the problems in some phenomenological research. So it can be that the findings are too superficial or just too obvious. Sometimes the use of the phenomenology is kind of incoherent. It doesn't really make any sense. It'll treat experience as kind of isolated rather than worlded. So it's like the participants seem to sort of come from nowhere, like they were in a vacuum. And then also just an over reliance on common qualitative validity criteria. And I'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. So this was the literature review that we engaged in here. So obviously within qualitative research, validity can, you know, it is vast in terms of what is available to us. It's almost like a buffet, as some authors have described it, right? And you can sort of see from my citations that it has changed historically from Lincoln and Guba's 1985 to Kane et al.'s 2023. There's no universal agreement on what constitutes rigor, and the list has evolved. There are a lot of overlap, I would say. But so then that sort of led us to kind of look a little bit deeper within phenomenology about what validity looks like. So generally speaking, there's an emphasis on like fidelity to experience, meaning are you being faithful to how the experience is described? Is it resonant, meaning like it doesn't have an emotional impact on either the audience, reader, or even the participants themselves? Is anything being revealed through the study itself? Like, did you learn something at the end that was sort of hidden away? And a lot of strategies will include things like member checking. And member checking, if you don't know, is just essentially working with your participants. Sometimes it means giving them the transcripts and saying, is this accurate to what you said? Sometimes it goes as far as having them co-analyze the transcripts with you. Um, Also audit trails. And really that is just like being transparent about the process of saying, this is what I did and how I did it. And then something very specific to phenomenology is the phenomenological nod. And that's kind of like that unconscious motion people give, like a nod of like empathy when they sort of hear about an experience that they emotionally resonate with, or even that they went through themselves, and like, yes, that description really captures it. Um, but a lot of the common qualitative validity criteria can also create problems. So, like I mentioned with member checking there in the literature, they talk about how that's not a good practice for some phenomenology because are we centering the participants' interpretation? And if they're living in that phenomena, can they really sort of see the bigger picture of the other participants? And then it sort of makes the interpretation quite scattered. So there are regular calls for rigor that are unique to phenomenology that persist of just saying we need to make it more rigorous, we need to make it more quality, and so this is the background that we came from. Um, so what that rigor call often means is we need to urge researchers to use the original philosophical text. And I don't know about you if you've ever picked up an ancient philosophical tome and tried to work your way through it, but it is quite difficult. It is quite burdensome and hard, and especially if you're a grad student or an early career researcher, it just, you have so much to do. It seems almost impossible. So we really sort of wanted to kind of build a bridge there. And so there are other scholars who I feel like are engaged in this. Horgan, Kelly Miller, and Dowling and Pham, I think. They really engage directly with philosophical texts to kind of be these bridge people. We specifically revisited Heidegger's existential structures to make philosophical grounding more accessible, which was kind of like a very uh, happy partnership between me and Francesca, with her coming from this philosophical background and me coming at it more from sort of a social science qualitative research methods background. Yeah, okay.
Okay, so our specific approach, what we wanted to do was kind of ground these three existential concepts that Heidegger really focuses on and put them into the interviewing process and also the analysis as well. So we returned to Heidegger's existential structures and developed this framework for judging the quality of the phenomenological interpretations. We've got three. We have thrownness, fallenness, and potentiality for being, and they all represent, like, thrownness is the past, fallenness is the future, and potentiality, or sorry, fallenness is the present, and potentiality for being is the future. um, and we'll describe those a little bit more in just a moment. I'm going to let Jonathan talk about the applications.
Yeah, so sorry about the image. For some reason, it didn't load there. It was just really sort of a almost like a cartoon image. Nothing special, I promise. But the application is we took those three principles and we tested this validity check within our own research first. Our study, Broodmother, was about teachers' limited access to bathroom breaks, and how it kind of makes them into this like self-sacrificing octopus creature that eats its own arm in order to even like be able to care for the children and never leave its brood, right? We're nothing if not descriptive with what we like to describe it as, right? So this helped us to kind of further articulate this framework that we built. But it also is going to help us illustrate these concepts in this presentation. So we're going to refer back to that as we describe each of these things.
Okay, so we'll start with thrownness. And like I was saying before, that represents the past, or as what Heidegger would say, the until now, because we always come into any given situation with a background, and that always affects how we move forward. So these, phenomena doesn't come from the sky. Everything has a history, and that is true of people as well. And by thrownness, what Heidegger means is that humans are thrown into a situation that's not of our own making. And we also inherit social, cultural, historical contexts. Um, and we want to look at the thrownness of everything as the starting point, or the until now, that the participants themselves never selected, or did not account for. Um, One of these things that kind of establishes thrownness would be attunement, which is very characteristic of mood, because you always have, what Heidegger says is we always have a mood. And so that mood is going to establish how we approach a given situation and even how we understand it. It also it discloses what is important to us and the way in which it is important. And it's kind of starting with this lens through which we will see the world. And it also, any kind of state of mind will also affect how we understand the circumstances. And then for the empirical application, in our study, all of the participants were teachers. So this led us to study the history of teaching itself, what we call historicality or historicity. So kind of the historical context. Horace Mann is often credited for founding the public school education system in the US. And he actually popularized hiring women as cheap labor alternatives for teachers. And he really emphasized this teaching as women's work in the sense that they are already, maternal by nature. And so we can kind of have a twofer. You get a teacher educating the children in history, science, English, etc., but you also get a little, alternative mother for, the school day. And this feminization of teaching will just continues throughout both the 19th and 20th and into the 21st century, and it being equated with mothering in general. And it creates this kind of self-sacrifice narrative for the teachers that involve mothering, and we believe heavily influences our particular phenomena of, denying themselves bodily functions. Right.
Yeah, and I'll just add that it really added a lot of richness to our own work when we started looking at like, hey, where did this phenomena come from, where teachers are sort of operating as mothers? And so we didn't know that prior to starting the study. It was something you sort of found through the process. So that kind of gets into what value it brings to the researchers. It may change your process. So I find it helpful because it shifts the focus from phenomenology just being this internal psychological only experience to, well, there are actually external forces that are shaping that phenomena. And it's giving the participants a whole world rather than just they sort of exist only within that phenomena. Um, so that in terms of methodology could impact your interview questions. You might end up asking more questions about the context and inherited norms. For us, it heavily guided our literature review, like it completely changed it once we sort of applied that and made us look more towards these structural forces. And it also framed the study around conditions that, were in place before the participants even existed, right? Not just their current experience with the lack of bathroom breaks.
Okay, so as far as how we could apply this, we have a few key questions here that you might consider during the interview process and also during your analysis. So first of all, do you kind of comprehensively describe the background that shapes the experience? You might look at the historicity like we did, also the political context in which it's placed, the situation is placed, and the social order via the societal and institutional placements, as well as personal conditions like the health status, family responsibility, etc. Also, in relation to these things, we can take a look at the attunement. What state of mind does, when you're creating the interview, you might ask, in what state of mind are you when you approach your situation? Do you start the day exhausted, nervous, exhilarated, etc.? And how this can explain how they relate to their situation and whether they, as Heidegger would put it, turn towards or away from it. And it could affects how they engage with the situation or how they might avoid certain aspects of their circumstances. Also, the physical and mental concerns, how do those govern their day-to-day interactions, and kind of getting an idea of what best describes the atmosphere or their working environment.
And I just want to highlight that word attunement that Francesca used is a specific Heidegger word, because I feel like sometimes that as we sort of go through this, that might be a concept that gets missed. So some of these are also like additional Heideggerian concepts.
Okay. So moving along to fallenness, which of course is our kind of present tense existential structure. The German for this is verfallen, and it's how we fall into roles and routines through our everyday busyness. It's the present moment that we're living through as we're moving through that everyday flow of life. And it's also characterized by what he calls the they self, which is basically this concept of conforming to what others expect or established norms, and how we can be swept away, we can become swept away. So as you see, we have a little illustration of Alice in Wonderland falling through the rabbit hole. Sudden, you have this, she's in a situation and she kind of questions how she even got there. And what we want to look at are these kinds of routines that make the world feel as though it's no longer a part of us. And it kind of has these routines that add up, and suddenly this world or even the self is no longer recognizable. So we can all probably, you know, empathize with what that's like, where the fallenness can make us feel like we're living the same day over and over on repeat, instead of having this prospect towards our specific future. And though our decisions are always future oriented, fallenness kind of clouds over the prospect of the future, so that we kind of, you get that feeling of, at the end of the day, you're another day older, right? As opposed to it being a natural progression through your own life. Also, to kind of add to this, there is a concept in fallenness that Heidegger talks about a lot, which is idle talk. And that's the nature of discussions and how they can become irrelevant to what's important. And these aren't always supposed to be necessarily negative connotations. This is just aspects of life that are kind of given. You're going to experience these in everyday life, and just how they affect you and your prospects is what we want to kind of focus on here. As far as the empirical applications, we found that teachers would fall into things such as tight schedules, clothing restraints, and kind of constant supervisional norms. In other words, like they would create these schedules basically around being able to go to the bathroom, right? They would get dressed specifically in clothing that would allow for, kind of faster access. And they would do these things almost not, subconsciously in a way. It made sense at the time, but then as they add up, things kind of, the whole job itself kind of changes to conform to this issue. The routines just came to form a definition of what being a teacher is for them. Also, the expectations from the students, parents, administrators, even their peers themselves would shape it as well, because they're all kind of in this same situation together, and they would internalize these routines and roles as, what is characteristic of a good teacher, even when it was harmful, even when, it was negatively affecting their physical and mental well-being.
So, in terms of how this is going to work as a researcher, I feel like there's a lot of things that we overlook in the research process because they're boring, right? We have a participant kind of talking about their routines and their things, and we kind of like just block it out because it's not the sort of like salacious part of what they have to say. And it really sort of like makes us direct our attention to the boring, to the mundane, to the routine. And it's like, well, no, like, how are these sort of overlooked, boring things actually really shaping how somebody is getting absorbed into something, right? Where just like as Francesca mentioned, it just becomes normal. Even the most bizarre set of circumstance just becomes normalized. Um, and it also sort of helped us look at how this they self it's going to shape the participants' behaviors and their understanding of themselves. And then, as I mentioned before, with thrownness, I think fallenness also does this as well, where you start to see the participant as a whole person, as opposed to just living inside of the phenomena. It's like, well, they're a whole person, and this is just sort of like who the phenomena is making them. And so, in terms of data analysis, methodologically, that has an impact because, again, it's going to direct your attention to those habits and routines you might not look at. Data collection, again, as you're sort of listening to things that feel sort of dry and not very interesting, even, you're actually, it's like, that might actually be the most important thing as you're interviewing to really ask about. Um, and yeah. And just sort of probing more into those expectations. I think for me, that often involves participants saying, well, it's just always been that way. Well, why? Where? When? How? I think a lot of times people will just sort of give these answers. And even if the participant says, well, I don't know, or maybe one time somebody got in trouble at work and that made everybody scared, or whatever the reason is, because you really start to unpack that they self through the fallenness aspect in the research process.
Okay, so some key questions that you might consider asking yourself and your participants. What are the actualities of living in this phenomenon? So, what, for instance, coping mechanisms might arise? We also want to look at the routines that are typical of each situation. What specific routines might make day to day life easier? And by default also make the situation itself less visible. Um, and then also considering the role that they play based on these others' expectations and what a little allowances, kind of day to day allowances, might add up and cloud the opportunities that would be otherwise available to them. We can also look at the kinds of conversations that they typically engage in with the people around them. Do they seek reassurance to justify the decisions that they're making? Are they, having conversations with each other in order to escape the situation at hand? All these kinds of things are possibilities to consider when looking at fallenness. Okay. And
So
then,
this, go ahead, sorry.
oh, go ahead if you wanted to
I
say
was just
something.
gonna say, I was just gonna say this image of potentiality for being sort of shows two paths that are like going different directions. And for us, this really kind of helped illustrate the image of, the world of possibilities, right?
Yes. So with potentiality for being, this is future oriented dimension of being. And this is how humans live towards possibilities not yet realized. And for Heidegger, we are always in the future in more ways than we normally think of. We are always projecting ourselves into the future in order to explore possibilities. That's the only way that we can make decisions, for example. And who we are, our identity is even shaped by these possibilities in the sense that we are our possibilities. And when I describe my identity, I'm always describing my potential. So if I say I'm a teacher, I am saying I have the potential to educate, students in a specific given area. It's always forward looking. And these possibilities also determine meaning. So when the possibilities change, so do our identities because we no longer have the same potential. And our sense of self emerges from the paths that we see as opened or closed. We also want to consider how the phenomenon itself is changing someone's future prospects. And then as far as the empirical applications, we particularly looked at the participants' sense of what they could be and how that had shifted from what they had originally envisioned for themselves. We also saw how these possibilities had narrowed from making a difference to just kind of managing survival logistics. So that's, of course, drawing on the fallenness itself and showing how all of these things, all of these existential structures form together. You can't really ever separate them out. They're always they're always participating with each other. So all of a sudden, they were no longer looking towards a future of making a difference in the student's life. They were just so caught up in managing their own survival logistics that they had kind of lost sight of that original goal. And it also, as a result, reoriented how they understood their identity as teachers. So I don't know,
So,
John, do you want to add anything?
well, I will at the risk of putting our audience off of us here. I'll say that Heidegger is sort of like famous for talking about the concept of Dasein, right? And essentially, what makes a human different than anything else, and it's this awareness of death. And Francesca and I like to joke around. We have a dark sense of humor where we sort of talk about that death anxiety. It's like, well, what do I want to do? Let me check my death anxiety today, right? I think that really gets into sort of how humans sometimes shape their decisions and what possibilities are around, right? Is that awareness of like, I will be dying. So what time do I have left and how do I want to choose it? So that always kind of helps anchor the concept for me as our death anxiety joke. So,
Yes, we're
um,
always oriented by our ultimate extreme, which for each of us is always death.
so cheery. So this, in terms of what it brings to researchers, it really offers you a window into how the participants are seeing themselves, how the phenomena is reshaping their identity and their role perception. So, like with the teachers, teaching is no longer about making a difference. It's like there are so many memes about teachers saying, "Oh, I'm a teacher. That means I can hold my pee all day," right? Like it literally changes like how we talk about the profession. And it shows a gap between those possibilities and actually lived conditions because you see, like, oh, here's maybe why this person signed up for this path or this role or whatever it is. And then here's what it is actually living in those conditions of the phenomena, whatever that is. Methodologically, I find it, of course, affects data analysis in terms of looking at how they understand themselves and what future they feel is possible for themselves. We had participants in this study who talked about how they can't have children while they're actively teaching because the idea that they would be pregnant and need the bathroom was too overwhelming of a thought, right? So it's having really big impacts on their life. Data collection, really talking to them about sort of their agency or like their loss of possibility. Some teachers would mention sort of the fact the legal weight in loco parentis. One of them kept mentioning over and over again. And that sort of changed what they thought teaching was. It went from being this fun, joyous thing of like, I better not screw up, right? I'm legally so responsible. And it really sort of transformed them, um, and helping the researcher track how the participants' sense of who they can be shifts through the phenomena. So it's not that the fact that you have to constantly supervise, it certainly changes your relationship to the children that you're teaching as well, right? So it can affect all of these things.
Okay, and then some key questions you can consider for potentiality for being. We can consider how that phenomenon shapes the participant's self-perception of what they see as possible for themselves, and how do those possibilities align with their personal goals if they do at all. Also, how their present choices that they make reflect their identity, and how has the role that they have fallen into shifted what they had originally envisioned for themselves? So, what constitutes important decisions for the participant? Heidegger often talks about every everything we do is a for the sake of which. You're never in a vacuum. You always are invested in the world, and we need to be aware of that and really ground the anything that someone does, for the sake of what? Is it for their own personal goals, or is it for something that, is a direct result of their thrown situation or any situation that they didn't kind of count on for themselves?
And this
Okay.
last slide is the TLDR. And I realize we didn't explain, if you don't know, TLDR is too long, didn't read. I just wanted to sort of throw that in there because I was like, oh, maybe we should sort of say that for people who don't know that abbreviation. So back to you, Francesca.
Okay. So basically, overall, what you want to make sure of is for each of these three concepts, for thrownness, you want to really get an idea of the situation itself. So even before we tackle the issues, we want to kind of paint a picture for yourself and the reader as far as what the situation is, what have they been thrown into. We also want to consider the background itself, so the political, social, institutional conditions that shape the situation or phenomenon. And that's where you can apply, like we did, historicity, historicality into that. For fallenness, we want to look at the routines and roles that the participants have kind of fallen into and how they shape the experience itself. Very much the day to day experience is what's important here. And what is it about being with others or dealing with the expectations of others that shape the experience? So for Heidegger, we are always being with others in the sense of that that's how we even know ourselves as what he calls Dasein, or being there because we are one of them, right? And how does that kind of shape our day-to-day experience? As far as the potentiality for being, you want to um, look at how your specific situation has shaped the participant's identity, how the participants are maintaining that identity, and whether or not that is conscious to them, and also how the participant's identity has changed or been constrained by the circumstances themselves.
This is our last slide, and it's just sort of a summary of the whole thing in a way. So, as we mentioned, the challenge in this area of research is that common qualitative validity checks don't always create quality phenomenology. So, specifically, those faithful descriptions, they don't always reveal anything particularly deep. And then we see researchers get stuck where it's a very surface level account and it kind of overshadows if it's just lots and lots of quotes, but there's not a lot of interpretive insight. What did we really gain from the process? And so we feel that this sort of return to the philosophical text of Heidegger's existential structures, thrownness, fallenness, potentiality for being, is going to help you to create that richer interpretation. And then finally, it's not all or nothing. So you may use one, two, or all three, whatever's going to help you deepen your analysis, your insight about the phenomena. I think certain types of phenomenology are very much geared towards potentiality for being, and some are really geared towards more thrownness. Even in our own research, we've sort of talked about how I would say potentiality for being was not as strong as the thrownness aspect and the fallenness. I think a lot of phenomenological research is pretty good about the fallenness aspect, or at least a lot of the phenomenological research that's in like the Van Manian tradition versus like the Smithian tradition. And I'd say a lot of like Smithian IPA folks have a really strong sense of that potentiality for being. So I think it just depends on what type of phenomenology you're engaged with as to which aspects of these are going to give the most oomph for you. And that is our presentation, and these are the references we used.
Hey, thank you so much. And Paul's there in case someone wants to take a screenshot. Uh, the group is small enough. I have a question I want to ask, but be thinking about group if you do want to unmic to answer a question. Obviously, you will be in the video then, so just be aware of that. I just think sometimes it's hard to ask questions about phenomenology. You really have to sit with it for a while. So I have a really practical question, thinking about from an instructor's perspective. So we know that typically when people send in a conference or a manuscript to be published, probably the most confused area of methodology is they'll say it's a phenomenology and it's not. In all likelihood, it's an interview study. People feel concerned that they're not naming it a methodology. So for my introductory courses, I think it's really important not to just do kind of the dominant five in the literature. So I do all those, the decolonizing, indigenous, the arts-based, action. That's an intro course, and they also have to do a study. So while I do say you got to think carefully, do you want to do phenomenology or grounded theory? They're really intense. Usually I'll say, does your faculty do phenomenology or are you around a philosopher? What would be your ideas for someone that wants to step into that and you're thinking they might have about 9 weeks to do the whole thing by the time they get through IRB? Some ideas for a very early person doing phenomenology.
That's a good question.
Yes.
Um, So I would say that certainly interdisciplinary collaboration is super helpful. If you have somebody in a philosophy department that you can pull in or has a philosophy background, like let's say you're in education and there's a social foundations person who has more philosophical training than your average person potentially. So that would be one. But two, I think it's really important that you get specific about the type of phenomenology you want to do. Because a lot of times people will say it in this very general sense, and it's just not, people sort of think of phenomenology as a monolith, and it's really many, many things. It's almost to me, it's like one of those methodologies where it's like a bunch of little kids stacked on top of each other with a trench coat and a hat on top, right? So I'd say that there is a lot of differences between the two. And as Francesca and I are actually writing about this with a colleague, some phenomenologists really can't stand one another, and they sort of tear down each other's methodologies, which I'm not really party to that. I sort of like to let everybody play. But if you're doing it quickly, I would say the most important thing is scope
Okay.
because phenomenology is really all about the depth. And I think a lot of times people want to go too broad. And really, it's like the process of analysis and interpretation and phenomenology, I would say, is the most time consuming.
Mhm.
Um, and I think that's different from other qualitative methods. I think that really you have to, a lot of phenomenologists call it dwelling with the data.
Mhm.
And I think you do have to do that sort of dwelling process. I mean, Francesca and I sort of were working, I'd already collected the data, and I would say what took us at least 6 months of dwelling with that data to really come up with what we thought was a good analysis. Is that what your memory is?
Um, yeah, it was about 5 months, right? I mean, you also want to look at the type. If you already have data, you want to look at the type of data you have, because like Van Manen requires a specific type of data versus Smith requires a completely different kind. Do they want pre-reflective versus very reflective data? So if you're going, you want to look at how that kind of fits your interview style as well, and just shop around, see what was it, started with a V, that Vagel that we use.
Mhm.
Yeah.
really good. It really helped us kind of narrow down what we wanted to do for our study and which would be the best approach to take. So definitely, yeah, make use of the resources that you have. And if they do have a philosophical section, because a lot of them do, I think the fear of the philosophy sometimes leads people to just skip that section. But,
Yeah.
I would say take advantage.
Mhm. Yeah, I'll add some of his resources to both the uploadings of the videos because I agree he makes things very accessible. And someone here is talking about grounded theory. I'm not sure why the two areas want to kind of inner fight because I always think it's really engaging when you get to talk to someone that's thinking differently than you. So
Mhm.
Kara said that she does a lot of work with grounded theory, and she's always saying you have to identify which approach is being used. The same with phenomenology. She's saying she agrees. And Rebecca said, thank you so much for the fantastic presentation. Would you share your thoughts on phenomenology in the context of a focus groups, as opposed to individual interviews?
Hmm.
Oh, we were just talking about focus groups.
I know it's funny, isn't it? This is a really challenging question because I would say the traditional approach to data collection and phenomenology is semi-structured to unstructured interviews, multiple interviews with the same participant, like 2 to 3 is very often, right? So with a focus group, I think what's challenging with that is that you always are looking at a dynamic between people, right? So it's not just about the individuals themselves. It's about that dynamic. So certain types of phenomenology wouldn't do well with that. For example, we reference Smithian like IPA phenomenology. He really almost is like for analysis, it's like a case study approach where you analyze each individual first before analyzing everyone together. So
Hmm.
I think you just have to be careful about like what type of phenomenology you were do. If you were to do like Van Manian or Ahmed or any of these others, I could see a focus group working because a lot of times you're looking more at the consensus around the phenomena, like what are the common conditions that are producing it. Whereas I think other types of phenomenologies are looking at like what are the different varieties of the way this phenomena can be experienced versus what is the common thread that really makes this phenomena what it is.
Now, here's a thought I have. I'm interested to see what you think. So, with the advent of critical theories and, of course, constructivism, people will take and borrow and blend methodologies, and they'll say this study is informed by PAR or something, but they're trying to say informed because they're saying we're not going to follow every step. Uh, are you seeing that in phenomenology? Because lately I did see a critical phenomenology where they might say this is informed by one of the major phenomenologists, not follow all the steps, or not really.
Yeah,
I feel
didn't.
like I go ahead, Francesca. I'm sorry.
Oh, I was thinking like 'cause there's lots of like kind of intersectional
Hmm.
phenomenological studies.
Yes, it's nice
So
you say that.
yeah, you don't really necessarily have to stick to one. I mean, looked at we've looked at a couple, right?
Yeah, I think more what Maria's question speaks to for me is this idea of like blended methodologies.
Hmm.
And so I've seen some that have done almost like it was like a IPA plus content analysis
Hmm.
approach. And it was just it's a little jarring.
Hmm.
And I think that it's a little bit like cooking where you put some things together and you try it out and you sort of see how it comes out. And sometimes you're like, oh, that's a little bit dubious as a food choice. So I think that the same is true for some of these combinations that they don't always work. I think that sometimes they could produce something really interesting, but I would just sort of say a lot of times with newer researchers, it depends on sort of where somebody is in the process. I kind of advise them to a more traditional path and be like, maybe just learn the rules first for like your first project, and then maybe you want to blend later. Or you want to pick somebody who's already blended. But if somebody feels ready to jump in and try something out, even if I just always sort of give them the warning, like it's like mixing colors. It may all come out gray.
Mhm.
It's hard to know.
Those are really good metaphors. And so in a class, it might feel like a safe space, but as soon as we take our work to a larger audience, to go to a conference or send it to a journal, certainly I agree that you would have to really know all those areas to be sure that you want to do that. And I guess I never know how you say his name. Vigil might be a good place to start because he feels much more constructivist. Okay, anybody want to unmic that had a question? Because I can certainly ask another. Okay, so then I am interested. I heard you allude to it a couple times. How did you decide on the version of phenomenology you were going to use? And were you saying that there are some articles, I know one at least, that compares all of them in a way that it's so hard to do in one article that's useful for a new early career person with phenomenology so they can think about that?
Um, yeah, go ahead, Francesca.
Well, we picked our specifically Van Manen, because it was very flexible, and we were able to kind of add what we wanted to do to it and apply it in the way that would reflect kind of, we wanted to like add the historicity because that's not originally in there. We could do these like add, these concepts of thrownness and fallenness and potentiality for being, and still kind of match up with what he was asking for with his pre-reflective examples. Um, I don't, did you want to add to why we picked?
Well, I would say the Vagel text is really, I say it Vagel, no idea if that's right. Lovely person too. I've met him in person. A wonderful, wonderful scholar. But it was so helpful because it laid out sort of like an overview of different types of phenomenology. I think, like Francesca's saying, it also really depends on what you want. I think that there is a lot of like structured to unstructured, like it's a spectrum within different types of phenomenology. So like I have a student right now who is exploring doing a more sort of Merleau-Ponty approach, but when she sort of found out like, wow, there's like not a lot of like methodology text that talk specifically about his type of phenomenology and how to enact it, it became overwhelming as a process. And I think that is just really like I think Smith does a really good job of like the step by step, like first you do this, then you do this. I think Van Manen's kind of in the middle where it's sort of like here and there. I think Ahmed, it's like if you want to be theory heavy, if you're comfortable living in that kind of world, it can still be lovely to do. I would kind of put her more like in the middle, but not quite over here. Um, so yeah, I think that it really just sort of it's all about what level of hard you want to play at in terms of the philosophy. And I think it really has a direct relationship to your comfortability with philosophy, because if you're not feeling super confident about that, that's going to be just really hard.
Yeah, I went ahead. We had said his name so many times. I grabbed a Vagel really quick. It's to a used book group, but I know internationally that doesn't always work, but at least you can see the full title. It looks like, Jonathan, he's in his third edition. I met him years ago when he was still at the article stage at AERA, and I agree. He's two things, very wonderful person, but his speaking is accessible, so it's not as off-putting for people that are interested in this early in their career. Okay, just one more opportunity. Did anybody want to ask something, and then we'll um, shift here slightly. Okay, I'm going to share if you, oh, here, why don't you unshare, Jonathan, while I ask you this? So
Yeah,
Pramila is
absolutely.
saying, could you recommend a good introductory reading for researchers starting in phenomenology? Dr. Coker mentioned Smith. Now, I'll look for Smith while you two respond because I feel like he has some webinars that are open on the internet. He does have webinars that you have to pay, but I'll look. I think there's one that you can be open. And I don't believe Smith is in the references, but you two address that while I glance really quickly.
So I would say that certainly there's some of the on our references slide, some of the Van Manen's ones that we reference would be great introductions. Smith has like a book. I was looking around my office because I was like, I may have it near me. And it's like a whole book that's like kind of a how-to. If you want to do Ahmed, queer phenomenology is great. So I think it's like you need two things. You need like a vagal text or something like that that will give you an overview of the different types. And then once you sort of pick one of those, you need to find like a text on that specific type of phenomenology that's going to help you get into it, right? Like you may want to do something like Naimanis does a really beautiful job of like post-structuralist phenomenology, right? And she has a really beautiful book. So yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I'm hitting up that they're paid. I found one by someone else, but here is his textbook. Some of you will be able to find it in your libraries because he's been quite popular, and I feel like it's in a second or third edition. If I can find the free one, I think that was Pramel. I'll email it to you all, but I'm not seeing it right now. I think in USD it often sits at around $100 for the webinar. Okay, because of time, we better shift. I really appreciate everybody's questions. I want to share quickly the next webinar. This advertisement isn't done because I like to get the person to agree with it, but this is a very interesting one. And actually, you experienced this, Jonathan, where he was wanting to be a professor and was doing something else for a while between the degree. And so Dr. Salmons has been a huge figure in qualitative research, working with SAGE methods. If you've ever been to their methods space, well, actually, if you haven't, I would try and get in there because they have so many free resources where, like, let's say it's a month about Black history in the United States, they'll unlock lots of articles around Black history and methodology so that you can often find stuff that unlocked that would usually be under a paywall, including they run webinars. They have a whole webinar series on writing and publishing, which we know is really important. So with her doing this, she's always been what she calls a free range scholar or a scholar in the wild. So it's this idea, well, what do scholars do that aren't linked directly to an institution? Things like, do they need to get research ethics approval? If they do, how does that work? She is a prolific textbook author, including that little series that many of your universities might have. It's like little quick fixes. It reminds me of the older blue and green books that Sage does. And I'd say one of her top expertise areas is online research. So she'll be talking about that, but you can ask her other questions, of course. And then we'll be sure to put her Substack and such in there because she offers, I would say, weekly advice. And right now is kind of going through an older edition of her online book and substacking it out about every week. And so you can look through that and try and find the scholarly reference, or you can just read it, of course, for the knowledge. So, hey, such a big thank you to you, Dr. Coker and Francesca. I appreciate it so much. Thank you, everybody, for coming, and I hope you have a good rest of your week. You're getting a lot of nice thanks here. Thank you both for your great presentation. Uh, I won't say good night because it's probably good night, good morning, good day with us having people from Tokyo and